They thought she was invisible, until the man who owned everything decided to look. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe now. Back to Amara Johnson. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered herself to the polished marble floor, the cold surface pressing through the thin fabric of her uniform as she reached for the scattered shards of crystal, a shattered wine glass that wasn't hers to break. The chandelier above cast a warm golden glow across the ballroom, reflecting off silver trays and champagne flutes, turning the entire room into something out of a dream. But down where Amara knelt, the light felt harsher, exposing every small movement, every breath she tried to steady. Around her, the laughter didn't stop. It never stopped. A man in a tailored navy suit chuckled softly as he stepped aside just enough to avoid the fragments without ever offering help. Another guest whispered something under her breath, and the group beside her erupted into quiet amusement, the kind that carried just enough to be heard but never loud enough to be called out. Amara kept her head down her fingers, careful as she gathered each piece one by one, mindful not to cut herself, not to make a scene, not to exist more than she already did. She had learned that lesson early. In places like this, invisibility wasn't just survival, it was expectation. The scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the string quartet continued playing in the corner. Uninterrupted, their melody, smooth and elegant, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if a woman kneeling on the floor at the center of the room was part of the design. Her reflection flickered faintly in the polished marble beneath her, distorted by the scattered glass, and for a brief moment she caught her own eyes steady, dark, refusing to break even as her hands shook slightly. A heel stepped closer, sharp and deliberate, stopping just inches from her fingers. Amara paused, her breath catching, before she slowly looked up. The woman standing over her was Clara Whitmore, draped in silk, the color of champagne. Her posture flawless. Her expression composed in a way that felt rehearsed, like she had spent her entire life perfecting the art of being admired. Clara tilted her head slightly, her gaze scanning Amara from top to bottom, not with anger, not even with irritation, but with something colder, something dismissive. "Be careful," she said, her voice smooth enough to blend into the music, yet sharp enough to cut through it. "You're making the floor look worse." A ripple of soft laughter followed from the surrounding guests, and Amara felt it settle over her like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. But she said nothing. She simply nodded once, lowering her gaze again, returning to the broken glass. Her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if any mistake would confirm what they already believed about her. A phone appeared in the corner of her vision, lifted casually by one of the guests, the screen glowing faintly as it captured her from above the angle. Unflattering, intentional. Another voice joined in, light and amused. "Maybe she should apologize for the mess," someone suggested, and this time the laughter came easier, more open. Encouraged by the lack of consequence, encouraged by the silence, Clara's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like approval, and she folded her arms, watching as if this were entertainment, as if this moment belonged to her. The music continued, the glasses clinked. Conversations resumed in low, elegant tones, weaving around the scene, as though it were invisible, as though Amara herself were nothing more than part of the staff moving quietly beneath the surface of something grander. Something shifted in the air, then subtle, almost imperceptible. A pause in the rhythm of the room, not in sound, but in presence, as if someone somewhere had stopped moving entirely. From the far end of the ballroom beyond the golden light, and polished surfaces beyond the careful laughter and curated smiles, a pair of eyes had been watching long before the glass ever shattered. Vincent DeLuca stood in the shadow just outside the main circle of guests, his posture, still his expression unreadable. The faint outline of his white dress shirt catching the edge of the light, but never fully stepping into it. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't needed to. Because in that moment, as Amara reached for the final shard, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the floor, while the room carried on around her like she didn't exist, something had already begun to change. And no one in that room, not Clara, not the guests, not even Amara herself, realized that the night they thought belonged to them had already slipped quietly out of their control. Amara placed the last fragment of glass onto the silver tray, her movements precise, almost mechanical, as if she could will herself to disappear into the rhythm of the evening, but the weight of the room had already settled around her too thick to ignore. The laughter had softened into whispers, now quieter, more controlled, yet somehow sharper, because it lingered longer, stretching across the polished space like a shadow that refused to lift. She rose slowly to her feet, careful to keep her posture straight, just as she had been taught, shoulders back, chin level, never too high, never too low. The balance between dignity and invisibility was a line she had walked for years, and tonight it felt thinner than ever. The faint sting in her palm told her she had not been as careful as she thought. A thin line of red barely visible against her dark skin, but she did not react. She did not give them that satisfaction. Instead, she reached for the cloth tucked at her waist and gently pressed it against her hand as if it were nothing more than routine. Around her, the music shifted into a softer piece, the violin drawing out long notes that filled the silence between conversations as servers moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying trays of sparkling drinks and delicate plates, the choreography of wealth continuing without interruption, as though the moment that had just unfolded was already forgotten, except it was not forgotten, not entirely, because Clara Whitmore had not moved. She remained exactly where she stood, her gaze following Amara with a calm curiosity that felt deliberate, like she was waiting for something more, something that would justify what had just happened. "You missed a spot," Clara said lightly, her voice drifting just enough to be heard by those closest to her. The words were simple, almost casual, yet they carried a precision that landed exactly where she intended. A few guests turned their attention back toward Amara, their interest renewed, like a performance had been paused and was now beginning again. Amara stopped for the briefest second, her fingers tightening slightly around the cloth, before she turned back, lowering herself once more to the floor, even though the marble was already spotless, even though there was nothing left to clean. The action was not about the floor, it was about control, about proving she understood her place, about ending the moment before it could grow into something worse. A man nearby leaned closer to another guest, murmuring something under his breath, and this time the laughter that followed was quieter, but heavier, weighed down by implication rather than humor. The phone that had been recording earlier lifted again, not hidden now, but openly angled towards her, capturing every movement, every second she remained on the ground. "Look at her," someone whispered, not bothering to lower their voice enough. "She does not even argue." And that was true. Amara did not argue. She did not speak. She simply continued the motion, wiping a surface that needed no cleaning. Her breathing, steady, her expression, calm, as if she had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only shield she had left. What they did not see, what none of them cared to notice, was the memory that flickered behind her eyes. The late nights in a small apartment, the soft hum of an old refrigerator, the stack of medical bills sitting untouched on a kitchen counter because there was never enough to cover them all. The textbooks she had packed away when she left school, the uniform she wore now replacing the scrubs she once dreamed of earning. Those things did not exist in this room. They had no place among crystal chandeliers and tailored suits and curated laughter. So she kept them to herself, just like everything else. A server passed by, offering fresh glasses of champagne to The guests and the man holding the phone accepted one without looking away from his screen, as if capturing her mattered more than anything else happening around him. "You should smile," he said suddenly, his tone light, almost playful. "People tip better when you smile." The suggestion hung in the air, absurd and cruel at the same time. And for a moment, even the music seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was waiting to see what she would do. Amara slowly lifted her gaze, not to the man, not to Clara, but to a point just beyond them. Her eyes steady her expression. Unchanged, and for the first time that night, there was something different in the silence that followed, not louder, not softer, but sharper, as if the room had shifted in a way no one could quite name. From the far edge of the ballroom, Vincent DeLuca had not moved, not since the moment the glass shattered his presence, still anchored in the shadows, yet the stillness around him was no longer passive. It carried weight, intention, calculation. The faint reflection of the chandelier caught in his eyes for a brief second, revealing a focus that had narrowed completely onto a single point in the room, onto a woman who had said, nothing done, nothing, and yet somehow held more composure than anyone else in that space. His fingers rested lightly against the stem of his glass, untouched the amber liquid inside, completely still, as if even that refused to move before he did. And though no one had called his name, no announcement had been made, no signal given, there was a subtle shift in the air that moved outward from where he stood, like a ripple too quiet to notice until it reached you. The conversations near him softened first, then stilled entirely, as one by one people became aware of something they could not yet see but could feel. A presence that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And still, Amara remained where she was finishing a task that no longer mattered, unaware that the silence spreading through the room was no longer about her, it was about him, and whatever decision he had not yet spoken aloud. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, something subtle that most people would ignore until it was too late. The music did not stop, but it softened just enough for the absence of conversation to become noticeable. Glasses hovered mid-air halfway to lips. Words were left unfinished, as attention drifted without anyone quite understanding why Amara felt it before she saw anything different. The way the air seemed to tighten around her, the way the quiet no longer felt like mockery, but something else, something heavier. She finished wiping the spotless floor and slowly rose again. Her movements controlled her breathing, steady, though her pulse had begun to quicken in a way she could not explain. The cloth in her hand was damp now, though she had nothing left to clean, and for a brief moment she considered stepping back, blending into the background, returning to the safe, invisible rhythm she knew so well. But when she straightened fully, she noticed something. That made her pause. Not the guests. Not Clara, not the man with the phone, but the way they were all looking past her. Their attention had shifted, drawn toward the far end of the ballroom, where the shadows met the light. Vincent DeLuca took one step forward. It was not a dramatic movement, it did not demand attention, and yet it changed everything. The faint gleam of the chandelier caught the edge of his face, revealing sharp lines, calm eyes, and a presence that did not need introduction. Conversations dissolved completely as the realization moved through the room like a silent signal. One by one, people turned their bodies, adjusting their posture, straightening their jackets, lowering their glasses, as if instinct alone told them something had just changed. Clara Whitmore noticed it too. Her expression remained composed, but there was a slight tightening at the corners of her lips, the smallest crack in a mask that had seemed flawless only moments ago. She shifted her weight subtly, her shoulders aligning. As she turned toward him, her voice ready. Before he even spoke, "Vincent, you should have said something sooner. I would have come to find you." Her tone was smooth, practiced, warm enough to sound natural, but not enough to invite closeness. It was the voice of someone used to being admired, used to controlling every room she entered. Vincent did not respond immediately. He continued walking each step, measured unhurried, until he reached the center of the ballroom, stopping just far enough from everyone to create space without asking for it. His gaze did not move across the crowd. It did not acknowledge the guests, who now watched him with careful attention. It settled instead on a single point, Amara Johnson. For a moment no one spoke, not Clara, not the guests, not even the man holding the phone, whose screen slowly lowered as uncertainty replaced amusement. Vincent's voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "Who asked you to do that?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. Clara blinked once, her smile returning quickly, though it carried a sharper edge now. "It was just a small situation, nothing worth your concern. She made a mess, and I simply asked her to clean it up." A few guests nodded faintly, as if agreement could restore the balance that had shifted, but Vincent did not look at them. He did not look at Clara. His eyes remained on Amara, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "Is that what happened?" he asked. The words were not directed at Clara. They were not directed at anyone who had spoken. They were directed at the one person who had not said a single word all night. Amara felt every gaze return to her, heavier than before, because this time it was not filled with amusement. It was filled with anticipation, with uncertainty, with something dangerously close to discomfort. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth before she forced them to relax. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in from every direction, the expectation, the risk, the invisible line she had always known not to cross. Her instinct told her to say nothing, to step back, to disappear again. But something in Vincent's voice, something in the way he had asked, not accused, not assumed, but asked, made that instinct hesitate. She lifted her eyes, meeting his for the first time, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to fall away. There was no anger in his expression, no visible judgment, just a stillness that felt deliberate, like he was waiting not for the right answer, but for the truth. Amara swallowed, once her voice quiet but steady. "The glass slipped, I cleaned it." It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either, and Vincent knew it. The faintest shift passed through his expression, not frustration, not disappointment, but recognition, as if he had expected exactly that answer. The silence that followed was different now, no longer uncertain, but charged every person in the room, aware that whatever came next would not be undone. Clara took a small step forward, her voice light again, though it carried a trace of insistence. "You see, it is handled. There is no reason to make this into something it is not." For the first time, Vincent turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on her, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop without a single change in his tone. "I did not ask you," he said softly, and just like that, the room went completely still. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a held breath no one dared release. Clara Whitmore did not move for a second too long, and in that fraction of time, the confidence she carried so effortlessly began to thin, not vanish but shift, just enough to be noticed by those who knew how to read it. Her smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes. "Vincent, there is no need to question this in front of everyone," she said softly. Her tone measured, careful, as if she were stepping across something fragile. "It was a simple mistake, and it has already been handled." Vincent did not raise his voice, he did not step closer yet. The distance between them felt smaller, as if the entire room had drawn inward around his presence. "Handled." He repeated the word quietly, as though testing its weight. "By whom?" The question was not rushed, it was not aggressive, but it landed with precision. Clara's fingers tightened slightly at her side, a movement so small most would have missed it. But not everyone. The guests nearest to her shifted subtly, their earlier amusement replaced by something more cautious, something that recognized the direction this moment was taking. I asked her to take responsibility for the situation. Clara replied, her voice still smooth, though the edges were beginning to show. That is what staff is here for. The word staff lingered in the air longer than intended, carrying with it an unspoken line that separated those who belonged from those who did not. Vincent's gaze did not waver, but something in it changed, not in expression, but in focus, sharpening in a way that made even the most confident guests lower their eyes. Responsibility, he said again, and this time there was something colder beneath the calm. For something she did not do. A ripple moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. The man who had been holding his phone earlier lowered it completely now, his hand dropping to his side as if suddenly aware of how exposed he had become. No one laughed. No one whispered. The performance had ended and something real had taken its place. Clara let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. You are making assumptions. Vincent, you were not even here when it happened? She said, and for the first time there was a hint of insistence in her voice, not quite defensive, but no longer entirely controlled. Vincent's head tilted slightly, just enough to acknowledge her words without accepting them. I was here, he said simply. I was watching. The words landed heavier than anything spoken before because they erased every excuse, every justification, every carefully constructed version of events that had been offered. Clara's posture remained upright, but the shift was undeniable now. The balance of the room no longer centered around her. Then you saw that she dropped the glass. Clara pressed gently her tone, attempting to guide the narrative back into familiar territory. You saw that she created the disruption. Vincent's eyes moved then. Not away from her, but past her, returning to Amara, who still stood where she had been. Her presence quiet, but unhidden now. He studied her for a moment longer, as if measuring something deeper than the surface before speaking again. Look at me, he said. The words were directed at Amara, and though they were soft, they carried an authority that could not be ignored. She hesitated for the briefest second, not out of fear but out of habit. Years of training, telling her to avoid eye contact, to remain unseen, to stay within the boundaries set for her. But those boundaries had already been broken the moment he chose to see her. She lifted her gaze again, meeting his. Fully this time her expression, steady, her shoulders squared not in defiance but in quiet resolve. The room seemed to narrow around that single exchange, every person present aware that something far more significant than a broken glass was unfolding. Vincent held her gaze for a second longer before turning back to Clara. Say it again, he said. Clara blinked, the request catching her off guard. Excuse me, what you said to her earlier? Vincent continued, his voice even. Say it again, exactly the same way. The request was simple, but it carried an unmistakable weight because it was not a request at all. It was a demand wrapped in calm. Clara's lips parted slightly as if to respond quickly, as she always had, as she always could. But this time the words did not come as easily. The room was no longer on her side, the laughter gone, the approval gone, replaced by a silence that watched and waited. She glanced briefly at the guests around her, seeking the familiar reinforcement she was used to finding, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke. Even those who had laughed earlier now looked away, unwilling to stand beside her. In this moment Vincent did not move, he did not repeat himself, he simply waited, and in that stillness the power in the room became unmistakable. Clara drew in a slow breath, her posture straightening once more as she attempted to reclaim control. I told her to be careful and to clean the mess. She said finally, her voice steady again, though quieter than before. Vincent watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking one final time. That is not what you said. And just like that, the silence returned sharper than ever, cutting through the room with a clarity no one could ignore. Clara's composure held for a moment longer, but it was no longer effortless. It was constructed carefully, piece by piece, like something that could fracture if pressed in the wrong place. Her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders squared as she met Vincent's gaze again, refusing to retreat, even as the room had already shifted away from her. "Then perhaps you misunderstood," she said, her voice controlled, though quieter now, as if the weight of the silence required it. It was not meant to be anything more than a correction. The word correction echoed faintly in the stillness, and this time no one responded, not even with a whisper, because everyone in that room understood that the conversation had moved beyond explanation. Vincent did not react immediately. He let the words settle, allowed them to exist fully before answering, as though giving them every chance to hold their meaning before he removed it. "You are careful with your words now," he said calmly. "You were not careful with them before." A faint tap. Intake of breath moved through the nearest guests, subtle but collective. The kind of reaction people could not control when something true had been spoken. Clara's expression tightened just enough to reveal the strain beneath her poise. "Vincent." "This is unnecessary," she replied, and for the first time there was something sharper in her tone. Not anger, not yet, but something close to it. "You are turning a minor situation into a spectacle." Vincent's gaze remained steady, his voice unchanged. "No," he said quietly. "The spectacle already happened." He gestured slightly, not broadly, not dramatically. Just enough to acknowledge the space around them, the room, the guests, the moment that had unfolded in plain sight. "I am simply deciding what it means." The words settled with finality, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Clara's lips parted again, but no sound followed immediately. And in that hesitation, something became clear to everyone watching. The control she once held over the room had slipped entirely. Vincent took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to command the center of attention without effort. "You asked her to apologize." He continued, his tone measured. "Not for the glass, but for being here." The statement was not phrased as a question. It did not seek confirmation. It delivered truth as though it had already been weighed and understood. Clara's eyes flickered briefly, not toward Amara, but toward the guests, as if searching for alignment, for support, for someone willing to stand with her, but none came. The same people who had laughed moments ago now stood still, their expressions carefully neutral, their silence louder than anything they had said before. "I expect a certain standard," Clara said. Finally, her voice lower now, more contained. "This is my event, and I will not have it disrupted." Vincent's head tilted slightly again, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement of what she had revealed. "Your event," he repeated, and this time there was a faint shift in his tone, not anger, but something colder, something more decisive. "In my house." The distinction settled over the room like a line drawn too clearly to ignore. Clara did not answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than any defense she could have offered. Vincent turned his attention back to Amara once more, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable but no longer distant. "What is your name?" he asked. The question caught more than just Amara off guard. It changed the direction of the moment, entirely pulling it away from accusation and into something else, something deeper. Amara hesitated only briefly before answering, her voice calm despite the attention fixed on her. "Amara Johnson." Vincent nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than it should have. "How long have you worked here, Amara?" he continued. 3 weeks, she replied. The answer was simple, but it carried the quiet truth of someone still new, still learning the rules, still finding her place in a world that had already judged. Her Vincent considered this for a moment, then glanced briefly at the manager standing near the edge of the room, who immediately straightened under the attention. "She has no prior complaints," the manager said quickly, his voice tight with tension. "Her record is clean. She has been punctual, professional." Vincent raised a hand, slightly stopping him before he could continue. "That is enough," he said softly. He returned his gaze to Clara, and for the first time there was no ambiguity left in the room, no uncertainty, no space for interpretation. "Then the problem is not her," he said. The words did not rise in volume. They did not need to. They carried a clarity that cut through every excuse, every justification, every attempt to reshape what had already happened. Clara stood very still now, her posture unchanged, but her presence diminished in a way no one could ignore. The balance had shifted completely, and there was nothing left to hold it in place. Vincent let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to understand before he spoke again, his voice steady, his decision already formed long before he said it aloud. "This is where it ends." And in that moment, every person in the room knew that whatever came next would not be negotiated, it would be decided. No one moved. The weight of Vincent's final words settled across the ballroom, like something irreversible, something that could not be undone or softened or explained away. Clara stood perfectly still, her expression composed but no longer in control. The confidence that once defined her presence now replaced by a careful stillness, as if any sudden movement might expose what had already begun to unravel Vincent. She said quietly, her voice no longer carrying the same effortless authority, "You are overreacting." The word hung in the air, fragile and misplaced, because nothing in the room felt exaggerated, nothing felt dramatic. It felt precise, calculated, inevitable. Vincent did not respond immediately. He allowed the silence to remain just long enough for her words to lose their footing before he answered. "No," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was something final in it now. Something that closed doors rather than opened them. "I am responding exactly as I should have from the beginning." "Oh." Faint shift passed through the guests. Those closest to Clara, instinctively stepping back, not in obvious retreat, but in subtle distance, the kind that separated them from her without acknowledging it. The alliances that had once formed so easily around her were dissolving in real time, and no one was willing to be the one left standing beside her when the outcome was no longer certain. Clara's jaw tightened slightly, though she kept her posture intact. "This is not about her," she said, her tone more controlled now, more deliberate, as if choosing each word with care. "This is about respect, about maintaining a standard in a room like this." Vincent's gaze held hers unwavering. "You are right," he said quietly. "It is about respect." The agreement caught her off guard, just enough to shift her expression for a fraction of a second before she recovered, but Vincent did not give her time to respond, "And you failed to show it." The words landed without force, without volume, yet they carried more weight than anything spoken before. Clara's breath caught almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since the night began, there was no immediate answer, no quick recovery, no effortless redirection, only silence. Vincent turned slightly his attention, moving beyond her, now addressing the room itself, though his voice remained as calm as ever. "If anyone here believes that dignity is conditional, that it can be given or taken based on position or convenience, then you are in the wrong place tonight." The statement was not loud, but it carried across the entire ballroom, reaching every corner, every guest, every person who had witnessed what had happened and chosen to say nothing. A few eyes dropped. Others shifted uncomfortably, the earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, because in that moment, it was no longer about Clara, it was about all of them. Vincent let the silence settle once more before continuing. "This house does not operate that way," he said. "Not for guests, not for staff, not for anyone." His gaze returned to Clara, and this time there was no softness, no room left for interpretation, and neither will I. Clara inhaled slowly her composure, returning in pieces, though not in the same form as before. "So what exactly are you saying?" she asked, her voice steady again, but stripped of its earlier certainty. Vincent held her gaze for a moment longer, then answered without hesitation. "I am saying that this ends now," he said, completely. The word lingered, final, unmistakable. A quiet murmur moved through the room, quickly silenced as people realized the weight of what had just been said. Clara's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the truth beneath it, the understanding that whatever this night had been meant to solidify had just been undone. "You cannot be serious," she said softly, but there was no challenge left in her voice, only disbelief. Vincent did not look away. "I have never been more serious," he replied. The stillness that followed was absolute. No music, no movement, no distraction, just the quiet reality of a decision that had already been made. Clara stood there for a second longer, as if waiting for something to change, for someone to intervene for the moment, to reverse itself, but nothing did. The room remained still, the guests silent, the outcome unchanged. Vincent took a small step back, not in retreat but in completion, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "This evening is over," he said calmly, "for everyone." The words moved through the room like a signal, and this time people reacted, not with confusion, but with immediate understanding. Glasses were lowered. Conversations did not resume. No one questioned it because no one needed to. Vincent's decision had already defined the space, and there was nothing left to argue. Clara remained where she was for a moment longer, the center of a room that no longer belonged to her. Before finally turning away, her movement controlled her expression. Carefully rebuilt, but the absence of power unmistakable. And at the center of it all, Amara Johnson stood quietly, the cloth still in her hand, her presence unchanged, yet somehow transformed, not by what she had done, but by what had been revealed. And in the silence that followed the room, understood something it had not. Before, respect had not been restored with noise or force. It had been restored with a single decision, spoken without hesitation and carried without question. The movement began slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the room itself needed time to accept what had just happened. One guest adjusted his jacket, another set down her glass with a soft, deliberate motion. Conversations did not restart, they dissolved completely, replaced by the quiet shuffle of departure heels against marble, the faint rustle of fabric, the low murmur of people who no longer felt comfortable staying where they were. The orchestra in the corner had stopped playing without being told, their instruments resting silently in their laps as they watched the room empty piece by piece. The illusion of elegance that had filled the space earlier was gone, replaced by something far more honest, something that could not be staged or controlled. Amara remained where she stood, her posture still composed, though her hands had finally stilled the cloth, no longer moving between her fingers. She was not the center of attention anymore, and yet she was not invisible either, not in the way she had been before. The difference was subtle but undeniable. People no longer looked through her. They looked around her as if unsure how to place her in this new version of the room. Vincent did not follow the guests as they began to leave. He did not acknowledge their quiet exits or their careful glances in his direction. His attention shifted only once more, and this time it settled fully on Amara. The distance between them was no longer defined by hierarchy or expectation, it was simply space, and he closed it with the same measured steps he had taken earlier, stopping just a few feet away, not close enough to intimidate, not distant enough to ignore. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question was simple, stripped of performance, stripped of the weight that had filled every word before it. Amara blinked, once the shift in tone catching her off guard more than anything else that had happened that night. She glanced briefly at her hand, where the faint line of red had already begun to fade before answering, "No, sir, her." Voice was steady but softer now, not out of fear but out of uncertainty. The kind that comes when something unexpected replaces something familiar. Vincent's gaze followed hers for a brief moment, then returned to her face as if confirming the truth of her answer rather than the appearance of it. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, before reaching for the folded handkerchief in his jacket pocket and holding it out to her. "Use this," he said. Amara hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because she did not know if she was meant to accept it. The gesture was simple, yet it crossed a line she had never been invited to cross before, the line between being seen and being addressed. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing the fabric for only a second before pulling it back to her side. "Thank you," she said quietly. Vincent did not respond immediately. He watched her for a moment longer, not with scrutiny, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing more than just the surface of who she was, and in that silence there was no pressure, no expectation, only space. The manager approached cautiously from the side, his posture tense, his expression uncertain. "Mr. DeLuca, should we?" he began, but Vincent raised a hand, slightly stopping him before the sentence could finish. "Everyone goes home," Vincent said calmly, the staff included. The manager nodded quickly, relief and confusion mixing in equal measure, as he turned to relay the instruction, moving through the room with renewed urgency. The remaining guests gathered their belongings quietly, no longer lingering, no longer watching as they made their way toward the exit, leaving behind a space that felt larger, emptier, more honest than it had at any point that evening. Clara Whitmore was gone. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence, the kind that followed a decision that did not require explanation. Her presence had filled the room earlier. Now it was as if she had never been there at all. Vincent's attention returned to Amara. "Once more, you should not have had to endure that," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying something different, now something that did not belong to authority but to acknowledgement. Amara held his gaze for a brief moment, longer than she expected herself to, before looking away, not out of submission, but out of habit, years of conditioning that did not disappear in a single night. "It is part of the job," she replied quietly. The answer was automatic, learned, repeated, accepted. Vincent's expression did not change, but there was a pause before he spoke again. "Not here," he said simply. The words were not loud. They did not carry across the room, but they did not need to. They settled between them, clear and final, redefining something that had existed long before this night and would exist long after it. Amara looked at him again this time, with a different kind of stillness, not guarded, not withdrawn, but thoughtful, as if she was hearing something she had not expected to hear and did not yet know how to fully understand. The room around them continued to empty, the last of the footsteps fading into the distance, the doors closing softly behind the final guests, leaving only the quiet echo of what had taken place. And in that quiet, something remained. Not tension, not conflict, but a shift, something small but undeniable, something that would not disappear with the night. Because for the first time since she had entered that house, Amara Johnson was no longer invisible, and for the first time in a long time, Vincent DeLuca had chosen to see someone no one else had bothered to notice. The ballroom no longer felt like the same place. The golden light still hung from the chandeliers. The marble still reflected every movement, but without the crowd, without the carefully curated noise, the space revealed something quieter, something more real. The echoes of footsteps had faded, leaving behind only the soft movements of staff gathering trays, straightening linens, restoring order to a night that had unraveled in ways no one had expected. Amara stood near the edge of the room, now no longer at its center, yet not entirely removed from what had happened, her fingers still holding the handkerchief Vincent had given her. The fabric folded carefully, as if it carried more weight than it should have. She watched as the last of the staff moved past her, their expressions subdued, not out of fear but out of thoughtfulness, as if they too had felt the shift that had taken place and were still trying to understand it. The manager approached again, this time with less tension in his posture, though. Uncertainty remained in his eyes. "Amara, you can head out for the night." He said, his voice lower now, more measured than before. "We will take care of the rest." She nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, but she did not move immediately. Her gaze drifted briefly across the room, taking in the empty space where the guests had stood, where the laughter had once filled the air, where she had been reduced to something less than herself, and then something more without ever changing who she was. Vincent had not left. He stood a few steps away, speaking quietly with someone from his security team, his voice low, his posture unchanged, as if the night had not disrupted him at all. Yet there was a difference in the stillness around him, a clarity that had not been there before, as though something unresolved had been settled without needing to be explained. When he finished speaking, he turned slightly, his attention returning to Amara, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the same deliberate awareness he had shown. "From the beginning, you are still here," he said. The observation was simple, but it carried a subtle invitation, not a command, not an expectation, just recognition. Amara stepped forward slightly, her movements calm, though her thoughts were not as steady as she would have liked. "I was waiting to make sure everything was in order before leaving," she replied. It was the kind of answer she had given countless times before. Professional appropriate distant Vincent studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Everything is in order," he said quietly. There was no need for further instruction in his tone, no hidden meaning, just a statement of fact that closed the space between responsibility and release. Amara hesitated briefly, then allowed herself a small breath, one she had not realized she had been holding since the moment the glass shattered. "Thank you," she said again, the words carrying a different weight now, not just for the handkerchief, but for everything that had followed. Vincent did not dismiss it. He did not deflect it. He simply accepted it with a slight inclination of his head, as if acknowledgement was enough. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It did not press or demand. It simply existed, allowing both of them to remain where they were without needing to fill it. "You said you were in school," Vincent said after a moment, his voice breaking the quiet without disturbing it. Amara looked up, slightly surprised, the detail, small yet significant, because she had not spoken of it aloud, not directly, not fully. "Yes," she answered cautiously, "I was studying nursing." The words felt distant now, like something that belonged to another version of her. Another time, Vincent's gaze remained steady. "Why did you stop?" he asked. There was no judgment in the question, no assumption, just curiosity. Amara's fingers tightened slightly around the handkerchief before relaxing again, her voice steady, though softer. "My younger brother needed care," she said. "There were expenses I could not cover and classes I could not attend at the same time." She did not elaborate. She did not explain the nights spent working, the decisions made in quiet rooms, the sacrifices that had become routine. Vincent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, yet attentive in a way that made the conversation feel balanced rather than unequal. "And you plan to return?" he asked. It was not a challenge. It was not even a question. In the traditional sense, it was an opening. Amara hesitated longer this time, not because she lacked an answer, but because she was not sure if it still existed. "I would like to," she said, finally. "When it becomes possible." Vincent nodded once more, his gaze thoughtful for a brief moment, before shifting slightly, as if considering something beyond what had been said. "Possibility is often a matter of timing," he said quietly. "And sometimes timing changes faster than we expect." The words were simple, yet they carried something beneath them, something not fully spoken, not fully defined. But present Amara felt it, though she did not fully understand it yet. She did not ask, she did not press, she simply stood there holding the space as it was offered. The room around them had settled completely now, the last of the staff finishing their work, the lights dimming slightly as the night moved toward its natural end. What remained was not the memory of humiliation, not the echo of laughter, but something quieter, something steadier, a moment that had shifted more than just the events of an evening, because in that space where everything had been stripped back to its simplest form, something had been revealed not through force, not through noise, but through a decision, and that decision had changed the way the room would be remembered long after it was empty. The night settled into stillness in a way that felt complete, not empty, not unfinished, but resolved. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, their golden light softening across the marble floor that now reflected nothing but quiet movement and fading shadows. The last tray was carried away, the final glass cleared the distant sound of a door closing, marking the end of an evening that had begun with spectacle and ended with something far more lasting. Amara stood near the entrance, now her coat folded neatly over her arm, the handkerchief still in her hand, though she no longer needed it. Her fingers tracing its edge absently, as if grounding herself in something real, something she could hold on to outside of everything that had just happened. She glanced once more across the room, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging the space for what it had become, a place that had revealed more than it intended. Vincent remained where he had been, though the distance between them felt different now, not measured in steps or position, but in something quieter, something less defined. He watched her for a moment, not with intensity, not with authority, but with the same deliberate awareness that had carried through the entire night. "You should not wait for permission to leave." He said, his voice calm, carrying easily in the stillness. Amara gave a small nod, understanding the meaning behind the words, even if she did not fully understand the shift that had made them possible. "I understand," she replied softly. She hesitated for a brief second, then added, "Good night, Mr. DeLuca." It was the same phrase she had used every evening since she started working there, the same respectful tone, the same measured distance, but this time it felt different, not because of what she said, but because of what no longer stood between them. Vincent inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without extending the moment beyond what it needed to be. "Good night, Amara," he said simply. The use of her name was quite unremarkable too. Anyone else yet? It settled with a weight she could not ignore, not because it was unexpected, but because it was intentional. She turned then, her steps steady, as she moved toward the door, the sound of her shoes against the marble softer now, without the echo of a crowd to carry it. The cool night air met her as she stepped outside the city, stretching beyond the gates, lights flickering in the distance, cars passing quietly, the world continuing, as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside. She paused for a moment on the steps, the air brushing against her face, grounding her in a way the ballroom never could. The events of the night did not replay in her mind, not as humiliation, not as triumph, but as something in between, something that had changed the shape of how she saw herself without altering who she was. She looked down at the handkerchief again, then folded it carefully, placing it into her coat pocket. Not as something owed, not as something borrowed, but as something given, without condition. Behind her, the doors remained closed, the house silent, the decisions made within it already settling into permanence. Inside, Vincent stood alone now, the vast room no longer filled with voices or expectation, just the quiet echo of what had been revealed. He walked slowly across the marble floor, his steps measured, not because he needed to be careful, but because there was no urgency left, no performance to maintain, no audience to consider. He paused where the glass had shattered earlier, his gaze lowering briefly to the surface that now showed no trace of it, no sign of disruption, no evidence of what had occurred except in memory. And yet the absence did not erase the moment it defined it. The house would look the same in the morning, the staff would return, the routines would continue, but something had shifted beneath it all, something that would not be undone by time or routine or silence. Because what had been decided that night was not about a broken glass or a misplaced word, it was about something far more fundamental, something that could not be negotiated or ignored. Vincent turned away from the empty space, his expression unchanged, yet settled in a way that spoke of certainty rather than reaction. The choices made had not been spontaneous, they had been inevitable, shaped by a line he had drawn long before this night began and simply enforced when it was crossed. Outside, Amara reached the gate, the city stretching before her, familiar yet different, in a way she could not quite explain. The weight she carried was lighter, not because her circumstances had changed, but because something within them had shifted, something that no longer allowed her to see herself as small or unseen. She adjusted her coat, taking a steady breath before stepping forward into the night. Her path unchanged, yet her presence within it undeniably different. And somewhere behind her, in a quiet house that had witnessed more than it intended, the echo of a single decision remained not loud, not forceful, but clear. And that night, without spectacle, without noise, the world remembered what dignity looks like.